Hi again, guys. I'm Kat Braybrick, also known as Code Cat. This lecture is part of a four-part series on critical making. In the other lectures in this series, we examined the systems of power that led to the dominance of a Western universalist techno-myth about maker culture, and we also examined critical making methods and decolonizations. Today we're going to take a look at the spaces where making practices occur and the theories that can help us think about spatiality as a critical discourse. Maker practices occur in many different kinds of spaces, from garages to schools to parks. But in this lecture, we will be focusing on maker practices in spaces that are used by humans, machines, and other entities within a community, where labor and leisure converge. While spaces of this kind have been referred to under various names, such as hack spaces, maker spaces, digital studios, and fab labs, we will refer to them here under the umbrella term shared machine shop, or open workshops with mentors and tools to make things with. By referring to space, I am speaking not only about shared machine shops, but also about the societal role played by spatiality itself, a concept deployed by post-structuralists like Henry Lefebvre, Edward Soja, and Doreen Massey, who have described space as socially constructed, built through myriad histories, practices, and networks. Our world, they explain, should not be thought of merely through spaces and borders on a map, but also through overlapping spatial moments that define our lived experiences of the environments we inhabit, intersected by our interactions and imaginaries. Because social relations are imbued with symbolism, meaning, and power, the spatial environments that we move through are also defined by geometries of power that intersect space with time. This is why spaces are experienced and also interpreted differently by each of us. If a shared space, like a makerspace, a prison, or a classroom, can be socially constructed through intertwined histories and interactions, it can also be colonized. Here we recall our discussion in another of these series lectures regarding the role played by cultural hegemony. The discourses of hegemony that have long been employed by UK museums, for example, and their myriad interconnections with British imperialism and colonialism have been well documented. Historians like Tim Berringer, for example, have traced geographical distributions of the acquisition of museum artifacts in the 1800s to parallel distributions of imperial capital and influence abroad. Meanwhile, governmental attempts to harness the power of public institutions in the Victorian era included efforts to pacify and educate the rowdy working classes by inviting them into the museum for civilizing, a form of societal self-regulation and control reinforced by the presence of well-behaved upper-class patrons. In 1984, Pierre Bourdieu famously described in distinction the ways that the duality of the public museum as a site of order and the public fair as a site of disorder in this period laid the groundwork for the ways aesthetics and cultural capital continue to be employed as key symbols of economic superiority. As the art hacker Graham Harwood of the Mongrel Collective stated in 2003, the museum became, and is still, a technical solution to the problem of displaying wealth and power without the attendant risks of social disorder. The relationship between spaces, users, and power becomes even more complicated when we again deploy an actor-network approach to understand a spatial environment by taking note not only of its human actants but also the other entities who are involved in constructing its borders and its realities. Noort G. Mehr's device-oriented work on the relation between public participation and material objects, for example, has shown us that designed objects, devices, and materials, for example, the electronic devices at a hackspace or cafe, also mediate and structure the nature of our experience of a space by fabricating us as political subjects at the same time as we fabricate them. However, as the Russian philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin has suggested, in these kinds of power interactions, it is always helpful to first look for the assimilation and then the protest. Here we will find that many spaces for digital making are not defined merely by their planners, i.e. those who envision and govern them, but also by the always evolving practices and needs of their users, i.e. those who work, make, and hack within them. This means that even the most hegemonic of environments can be viewed as contested. carrying its own cosmopolitics or overlapping worlds, in the words of Latour and Stenglers, which allows alternatives to arise in unexpected ways. These unexpected ways include the temporary autonomous zones, or TAZs, of the anarchist poet Hakim Bey, who published a set of essays in the 1980s that set out a concept known as the TAZ, a liberated and mobile space that refuses to wait for a revolutionary moment in history to exist, but also refuses to be incorporated into the dominant narratives of late capitalism, instead bringing an intentional community together to be for something, not just against, in a celebration of free culture. A TAZ, explains co-founder of Reclaim the Streets John Jordan, should feel like an exceptional party where for a brief moment our desires are made manifest and we all become the creators of the art of everyday life. Informed by Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle, and here we harken back to psychogeography and situationism, which describe the ways the simulacra of mass advertising would always render attempted creative rebellions into commodities, the TAZ had its greatest impact in the internet cybercultures of the 1980s and 1990s, because it looked a lot like the networks of resistance imagined at that time by those who felt part of a digital underground. Inspired by cyberpunk writers like Bruce Sterling and William Gibson, and manifestos of cyberspace like that of John Perry Barlow, who called for an internet that would be forever free from corporate and governmental restriction. In a world of overwhelming corporate control, Bay and others felt, all revolutionary movements would eventually be assimilated, unless sites for radical intervention were formed and then quickly closed up again before they could become commodified. They believed that the spaces of countercultures could not only use the web and digital technologies to escape into autonomy. They must also build tactical methods and artifacts that would involve others in creating new alternatives. As Bay wrote in 1988, "We do not live in cyberspace. To dream that we do is to fall into cybergnosis, the false transcendence of the body. The TAZ is a physical space, and we are either in it or not. All of the senses must be involved in this." The TAZ, since the 1980s, has inspired a wide variety of creative projects, from the early iterations of Burning Man in Black Rock City held by the Cacophony Society, to a new creative space called Manjim, or Rich Seam, which has recently emerged next to the Haifa train station in Palestine. Meant to be a temporary yet welcoming environment for new ideas, the artists and makers who founded the space wanted to feel unfinished. It is a deliberate work in progress, they say, but it is also a reclaiming of local identity and history in a highly contested city. The tactical nature of the temporary autonomous zone was also evident in the first wave of shared machine shops in Europe, which can be traced to 1970s London, when industrial workers at the Lucas Aerospace Corporation in 1976 united with local labor unions, factories, and socialist co-ops to build community technology networks in neighborhoods across London in order to test new technologies that might be relevant for socially useful production over private profit. Innovations ranged from children's play equipment to small-scale wind turbines to disability devices. The first hack labs and media labs that opened across Europe in the 1990s employed similar tactics to build a better world, and in the case of the media lab, new possibilities for a more creative, radical, and collaborative internet. A mixture of artist studio, hackspace, and Californian cybercafe, famous media labs like Arttech and Backspace, both based in London, helped inspire a new generation of practitioners and artists to explore the implications of computer networks. The second wave of shared machine shops in Europe have typically been referred to as hackspaces, preferring closed memberships to provide a safe space for those who just love to hack. The goal of these sites, many of which still exist today and are going strong, like Berlin's C-Base pictured here, which was founded in 1995, was typically long-term community salience over overt politicization, a fostering of greater public legitimacy for hacker subcultures in light of crackdowns on illegal activities that occurred during the mid-2000s. Around this period, if spaces wanted to stick around, they had to become a lot less like TAZs and a lot more like community centers. The third wave of shared machine shops emerged when hacker subcultures became a mainstreamed movement of those increasingly intrigued by the digital, with makerspaces, fab labs, and open workshops opening around the world. 2008 has been cited as a key year in shared machine shop history, when a widely publicized exchange between German hackspaces and American activists called Hackers on a Plane brought these sites to the attention of various publics for the first time. It can also be defined as the moment where the practices of openness, that is, the free and agile sharing of ideas, templates, code, and designs, along with systems for locally distributed fabrication, came into maturity as alternative systems of socio-economic production within shared machine shops. The makerspace is a third wave shared machine shop variant that has been especially successful, with over 100 sites opened in the UK alone. Remember O'Reilly Media? They started the makerspace name, but unlike the Fab Lab network, where member sites must carry specific digital fabrication equipment, the makerspace title, while it is derived from the West, has been left open for spaces around the world to interpret, and today many makerspaces typically choose to employ the term maker culture to democratize shared machine shop traditions by drawing in new kinds of users who may be more interested in activities not typically found in other kinds of shared machine shops, from crafting to e-textiles. Since 2015, a fourth wave of shared machine shops has started to emerge that are hosted in collaboration with external partners, from makerspaces in universities to mobile Fab Lab and library hybrids. This wave is also defined by an increased institutionalization of maker practices, with a new generation of collections makerspaces, or makerspaces that are centered around a cultural archive, opening through partnerships between institutions and brands, like the British Museum's Samsung Digital Discovery Centre pictured here. These kinds of alliances, where maker practices are deployed in spaces built around the needs of both grassroots and institutional partners, can be fragile and marked by contrasting priorities. As community innovation scholars like Adrian Smith have noted, tooling up does not necessarily lead to social change now, especially when funding targets come into play. There can also be tensions with those who see the current iteration of shared machine shops as offensive variants of a once autonomous ecosystem of alternative spaces for alternative methods. This year, a group of anarchists burnt down Fab Lab La Casemate in France, releasing a lengthy public statement describing it as a notoriously harmful institution in their eyes, claiming it represented not revolution but instead capitalism, corporate power, and unpaid microwork. However, drawing this tale back to our earlier discussion of the fluid complexities of the spatial, we can choose to view spaces of this kind not as static, but instead as ongoing experiments, embodying in their practices the evolutions and also the conflicts of late capitalist society itself, their emergent alliances between human and non-human actors, extending our own understandings of material participation in the process. I'll leave you here with another quote from Staying with the Trouble by Donna Haraway. "With my littermates, who find a rich wallow in multi-species muddles," she says, "I want to make a critical and a joyful fuss about these matters. I want to stay with the trouble, and the only way I know to do that is in generative joy, in terror, and in collective thinking." And now it's your turn. Your call of action for today is to take a critical look at your own experiences with the spatial environment of a shared machine shop, whether it is Makerversity or another space. Build your own actors map of the space's networks using the attached guide, and don't forget to include influential non-human actors, from machines to symbols, as well as humans. A few questions for discussion. First, how would you describe the relationships you observed between networked actors? Second, are some kinds of actors more dominant than others? Does the space itself reinforce this? And third, in building your actor map, did you find yourself unearthing anything unexpected? So thank you for thinking through these ideas with me today. Again, I would be very happy to discuss anything further with you, so please do feel free to get in touch at CodeCat. Goodbye.